In the dimly lit, opulent setting of a Michelin-starred restaurant, the air buzzed with the energy of high stakes and high society. The sound of clinking glasses, soft murmurs of well-dressed patrons, and the faint melody of a live string quartet filled the background as a Japanese billionaire, Hiroshi Takeda, sat poised at the center of it all. Before him, on the polished wooden table, lay a contract, the culmination of months of negotiations, a deal so lucrative it promised to solidify his empire for years to come. The gold ink on the page shimmered under the soft glow of candlelight, and Hiroshi's sharp, calculating eyes lingered over the terms, as though he could already taste the victory. At his side, his fiancée, a stunning woman of impeccable grace, smiled warmly, her hand resting lightly on his arm as she leaned in to whisper, "This is it, Hiroshi. This will change everything." Her voice was smooth, reassuring, and the faint scent of her perfume lingered in his mind. She believed in the deal. She believed in the future they would create together. Yet, despite her confidence, a small voice in Hiroshi's mind was stirring. He looked down at the contract again, his finger hovering over the lines where his signature was meant to be, when a voice, quiet, but sharp with urgency, cut through the moment. "Don't sign it," said a young black girl, barely in her teens, sitting across the table. Her eyes were wide, brimming with a mixture of fear and certainty. Hiroshi's gaze snapped to her, his brows furrowing as doubt began to cloud his sharp, calculated thoughts. The girl was an unexpected presence, out of place in the upscale restaurant, dressed in modest, simple clothes. She hadn't been invited, yet somehow, she had found her way into this pivotal moment. Hiroshi's fiancée, sensing the tension, tightened her grip on his arm, her smile faltering as she shot the girl a look of disdain. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her tone tight, her face flushed with embarrassment at the intrusion. But the girl, unfazed, unshaken, didn't look away. Her eyes locked onto Hiroshi's, and in that brief moment, the billionaire felt a wave of discomfort ripple through him. "It's a trap," she repeated, her voice steady now, but her hands trembled slightly, betraying the gravity of what she was saying. The world around them seemed to slow as Hiroshi's eyes flicked between the girl and the contract before him. There was no reason for her to be here. No reason for her to know anything about the deal on the table. But the certainty in her voice, the intensity in her gaze, planted a seed of doubt in his mind, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He had built his empire with cold calculation, with precision, never once second-guessing his instincts. Yet here, in the quiet hum of the restaurant, with the delicate clinking of glassware and the hum of conversations swirling around him, a sense of unease settled over him. Hiroshi's fiancée, sensing the shift in his demeanor, leaned in even closer, her voice now a whisper, almost coaxing. "Hiroshi, you can't back out now. This deal is everything we've worked for." There was urgency in her words, desperation hidden beneath the polished exterior. Hiroshi's hand hovered over the pen, the tip of the ink just brushing the paper. His mind raced, but his thoughts were clouded, caught between the world he knew, this life of luxury, control, and calculated risk, and the raw, unrefined truth that seemed to be emanating from the young girl in front of him. He glanced at her again, and this time, her face was soft, vulnerable, yet undeniably resolute. Something in his chest tightened, as though an unseen force had gripped his heart. His fiancée's voice grew louder, more insistent, her words now mingled with a hint of frustration. "If you don't sign, we lose everything. Everything we built." Hiroshi's eyes flitted between the girl and his fiancée. The decision, now hanging heavily over him, felt like an impossible choice. His fiancée's face was a mask of fear and ambition, while the girl's eyes held nothing but an honest, almost painful clarity. The weight of both their expectations crashed against him, the pull of his fiancée's dreams and the girl's warning warring inside his mind. The restaurant's atmosphere felt suddenly oppressive, the laughter of nearby tables growing distant as Hiroshi fought the battle between instinct and reason. Was he about to make the biggest mistake of his life, or was this child a mere distraction, a piece of chaos in the well-oiled machinery of his world? The seconds stretched into eternity. Finally, Hiroshi set the pen down, his hand trembling, not from weakness but from the magnitude of what he was about to do. The decision would change everything. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze locked on the girl. She looked at him with a sadness beyond her years, as though she had seen this story play out too many times before. "Because," she said softly, "sometimes the people closest to you have their own reasons for wanting you to fail." And with those words, Hiroshi felt the weight of the world shift. The billion-dollar deal, so perfect on the surface, was no longer just a business decision. It was a reflection of the life he had chosen, the people he had trusted, and the future he now feared would be built on a lie. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, charged with an undeniable tension as the billionaire sat at the grand mahogany desk, the legal document laid out before him. His fiancée, a stunning woman with an aura of confidence, stood by his side, her fingers gently brushing against his arm in an effort to comfort him. Her voice was smooth, persuasive, as she reassured him, "It's all perfectly in order. You don't need to worry about a thing. This is the right step for us, for our future." But beneath her polished words, something felt off, something he couldn't quite place. His gaze drifted from the document to her face, searching for signs of sincerity. He had always trusted her, admired her ambition, and loved her in a way that made him feel certain of their bond. But the more she spoke, the more the young girl's warning echoed in his mind. He had met the girl just days earlier, a stranger who had approached him in the park, her innocent eyes filled with something unspoken, her words unnervingly clear, "She's only after your money. Be careful." The memory of that moment lingered like a shadow in his thoughts, impossible to ignore. The billionaire tried to shake off the unease, telling himself it was nothing more than a strange coincidence. After all, the young girl didn't know him, didn't know his fiancée. Yet, the nagging feeling refused to leave him, like a faint whisper at the edge of his consciousness. He looked at the document again, the lines of text swimming before his eyes. The legal jargon seemed endless, impersonal. His fiancée had always been the one to handle these things. She was so much more capable, so much more knowledgeable than he when it came to business matters. He trusted her judgment, perhaps too much. But now, as the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, the words began to blur into something far more ominous. Her insistence on signing immediately only seemed to add to the growing sense of doubt. She had been so confident, so sure, yet there was a quiet urgency behind her smile, something that didn't sit right with him. Why the rush? His mind wandered back to the warning. Could she really be deceiving him? The thought was unbearable, yet the more he thought about it, the more plausible it seemed. He had always believed in the goodness of people, but what if she had been pretending all along, playing the part of the perfect fiancée while secretly plotting for something far darker? The room seemed to close in on him as the weight of the decision pressed heavily on his shoulders. Every second felt like an eternity, each tick of the clock only deepening the uncertainty that had settled in his chest. He tried to focus, to block out the whispers of doubt, but they wouldn't let go. His fiancée's reassuring words no longer felt comforting, but suffocating. She had been so eager, so insistent, Yet every word that left her lips seemed to pull him further away from the truth. The cold sweat on his brow wasn't from the heat of the room, but from the growing realization that he was standing at the precipice of something far more complicated than he had ever imagined. She leaned in closer, her lips brushing against his ear as she urged, "You know this is the right choice. You know it's what we both want." But now, he wasn't so sure. Her touch, once a source of comfort, now felt like a subtle manipulation. Was this what he had been blinded to all along? The billionaire's eyes flickered toward the door, as if seeking an escape, but there was no easy way out. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the entire world collapsing into the space between him and the woman he thought he knew. The silence between them grew thicker, more suffocating with each passing second. He had always prided himself on his ability to make decisions, to see through the noise and focus on the facts. But right now, all he had were questions, swirling around him like a storm he couldn't navigate. Is she really who she says she is? The thought haunted him, gnawing at his resolve. The uncertainty in the room was palpable, like an invisible force that threatened to unravel everything. He reached for the pen, his hand trembling as he hovered over the document. He wanted to sign, to make the decision, to move forward with the life he had imagined. But something inside him screamed that this was not right, that the girl's warning was more than just a fleeting concern. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The billion-dollar question loomed before him, and in that moment, he knew he couldn't make it without the truth. His fiancée, sensing his hesitation, stepped back, her expression shifting from warmth to cold impatience. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," she said, her voice sharp, no longer the soothing melody it had once been. The billionaire set the pen down, his heart pounding in his chest as he looked up at her, the once familiar face now a mask of uncertainty. Who was she really? The question echoed in his mind as he stared at her, the woman he thought he knew, unsure of whether he could trust her anymore. The silence stretched on, each second more unbearable than the last, as the weight of the decision grew heavier. His future was hanging in the balance, and he was no longer certain of the woman standing before him. The billionaire sat in the lavish, dimly lit study, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a 1,000-pound stone. In front of him lay the contract, his fiancée's terms for their upcoming marriage, a document that had seemed harmless enough at first but now felt like a labyrinth of hidden clauses and veiled intentions. The young girl, his assistant, had been hesitant at first to speak up, but now she stood beside him, her voice low and insistent. "Sir, you need to look at this clause here," she pointed out, her finger trembling ever so slightly. The billionaire, his once steadfast confidence beginning to erode, scanned the document again, reading the fine print. The words blurred together at first, but then something caught his eye, something subtle yet deeply unsettling. It was a clause granting her and her associates a significant share of his fortune, should anything happen to him within the first few years of the marriage. His breath caught in his throat as he reread the lines, the implication of what he was seeing beginning to dawn on him. The contract was no longer just a legal formality, it felt like a trap, a carefully orchestrated design to manipulate him. A chill ran down his spine as the thought crept in: was his fiancée a part of this scheme? Was she in on it, playing him for a fool? He looked up at her, seated across the room, her face lit by the soft glow of the desk lamp, her eyes downcast in a way that seemed almost rehearsed. The smile she had worn just moments before seemed like a mask, and the warmth in her eyes felt hollow, as if the love they once shared had begun to evaporate. The young assistant's words echoed in his mind as he processed what had once been a simple question: why had she been so adamant about him signing this contract without thoroughly reading it? His heart raced, And for the first time in their relationship, doubt seeped in like a poisonous fog. His mind spiraled, reeling from the possibility that the woman he had planned to spend his life with could be the architect of his undoing. What had started as a rush of excitement over their union had now turned into a slow, sinking realization of betrayal. He glanced at the young assistant again, the girl who had been with him through thick and thin, who had always had his best interests at heart. Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw something more than just professional concern. There was a hint of worry, too, as if she were afraid that by pushing him, she might be driving a wedge between him and the person he loved. But she had been right to raise the alarm. His fiancée's behavior, the secrecy surrounding the contract, it all pointed towards something darker, something he had not been willing to face. The room seemed to close in on him, the air thick with tension. He could hear the faint sound of his fiancée's heels clicking softly on the floor as she shifted in her chair, her anxiety now palpable. The carefully crafted facade she had worn so easily was beginning to crack, revealing the cracks of unease beneath. He watched her hands fidget with the hem of her dress, her eyes darting to the document, then quickly away. The familiar calm confidence that had once drawn him to her now seemed like a performance, one that had been perfected over time, honed to manipulate. His mind raced back to the countless moments when she had pushed for decisions, for quick answers, for actions that had always seemed to benefit her in some way. He had dismissed them as harmless, chalking them up to her enthusiasm or love, but now he wondered how many times she had orchestrated moments of weakness, knowing exactly how to play to his sense of obligation and affection. The assistant's voice brought him back to the present. "Sir, you can't ignore this. There's too much at stake." The billionaire's hands trembled as he ran them through his hair, the weight of betrayal beginning to sink in. This wasn't just about a business deal gone wrong, it was about trust, about the very foundation of the life they had built together. The love he had once believed was pure now seemed tainted by ulterior motives. He looked at her, his fiancée, the woman he had chosen to share his future with, and something inside him broke. The emotional wall he had carefully built around his heart cracked, letting in the cold reality. How long had she been planning this? How many lies had he swallowed, thinking them to be truths? And the more he thought about it, the more the evidence stacked up, each small detail now glaringly obvious. The way she had always sidestepped questions about her family's financial dealings, the way she had insisted on controlling the direction of their business ventures, the subtle manipulations that, in hindsight, seemed so calculated. The assistant's voice quivered, full of emotion now. "I never wanted to come between you two, sir. I just didn't want to see you hurt." His fiancée, now sensing the shift in his gaze, stood up abruptly, her calm demeanor faltering for the first time. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice rising in a mix of confusion and irritation. "Why are you questioning me? Why is she even involved in this?" The tension between them was palpable, an invisible force crackling in the air. It was a moment of truth, one that had been building for weeks, months even, but now felt like a violent crescendo, one that could no longer be ignored. As the billionaire stared at the woman he had once believed to be his soulmate, he knew that the truth had finally come to light. The world he had built with her was not the one he thought it was. And now, as the curtain fell on their relationship, the hidden motives, those dark, twisting forces had finally revealed themselves, leaving him to decide just how much he was willing to sacrifice for love, and whether he could ever trust again. The billionaire sat at his sleek, glass conference table, the documents before him a blur of legal jargon and fine print, but he wasn't focused on the words, his mind was elsewhere, lost in the intoxicating promises of wealth, power, and influence. His fiancée, Lila, sat beside him, her reassuring smile never wavering as she spoke of the incredible opportunity the contract represented, a chance to secure their future, a deal that would put their empire on the map for generations to come. But across the room, a young girl, no older than 18, stood in sharp contrast to the polished world that surrounded them. She was quiet, unassuming, and yet in her eyes burned a resolve that spoke louder than any boardroom presentation could. She had seen something in the contract that no one else had noticed, something that none of the other executives or advisors had caught. She had studied the documents for days, and what she saw scared her for the billionaire, for his business, for everything he had built. Her voice, though soft, carried a weight that none could ignore. "You don't understand," she said, her words trembling with urgency. "This deal isn't what it seems. You're not just signing away a part of your company, you're signing away your future." The billionaire, who had spent years building his fortune, stared at her, disbelief clouding his sharp features. Lila, ever the voice of confidence, glanced between the two, her expression a mask of confusion and mild irritation. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her tone calm, dismissive even. "This is a golden opportunity, darling. We've worked too hard to pass this up." The young girl took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been one to challenge authority, especially not in the presence of someone like the billionaire, but she couldn't stay silent. "Not now. This isn't just about money," she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "If you go through with this, you'll lose more than just your wealth. You'll lose your reputation, your integrity, everything you've worked for. The contract is rigged to drain your assets, to make you pay for something you'll never receive." The room fell quiet. The billionaire's eyes narrowed as he looked at the young girl, studying her for a moment. Was this a threat? Was she trying to sabotage the deal out of jealousy or personal gain? But there was something in her expression that told him she wasn't lying. She wasn't trying to get anything from him. She was warning him. Lila's face flushed with frustration, her patience wearing thin. "This is absurd," she said, her voice rising. "You don't know what you're talking about. We've checked everything. We've had the best lawyers look over it." "You can't just—" "I know," the girl interrupted, her voice sharp now, her gaze unwavering. "I know you've had experts look at it, but you missed the fine print. It's buried in there, hidden in clauses and terms that don't seem important at first. But trust me, if you sign this, you'll be bound to obligations you can't escape. It will slowly drain you dry, piece by piece, until there's nothing left." The billionaire was torn. Lila's reassurances still echoed in his mind, her confidence a balm to his growing unease. She had always been his rock, the one who believed in the big picture, who pushed him to dream bigger, to take risks. She had been by his side through every step of his rise to the top, and she had never steered him wrong. But the young girl's words rang in his ears, the weight of her warning settling in his chest like a stone. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind, whispering that maybe, just maybe, he had been blinded by ambition. Maybe he had been so focused on the future, so eager to secure a legacy. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, the kind that felt almost tangible, pressing in on the walls and making it difficult to breathe. The billionaire, standing near the edge of the grand mahogany desk, his fingers gripping the contract in his hands, could hardly believe what he was reading. The fine print, the clauses hidden behind layers of legalese, seemed to mock him. His eyes flickered up to the woman across from him, the fiancée who had been by his side for years, whose charm and beauty had once made him feel invincible. But now, Under the dim light of the chandelier, the glossy exterior seemed to peel away, revealing something colder, more calculating beneath. "This isn't what we agreed upon," he said, his voice tight, his jaw clenched. "How could you sign this without telling me what was in it? You promised transparency, honesty, everything we built together." The words hung in the air like daggers, each one piercing deeper into the fragile trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship. The fiancée, her face flushed with frustration, straightened, trying to maintain composure. "You don't understand," she replied quickly, her voice smooth but tinged with a defensive edge. "This is for the best for both of us. This contract secures our future, our life together. You're thinking too small." She stepped toward him, her heels clicking against the marble floor, the sound sharp and deliberate. "I've been looking out for us, for our future. You don't realize what's at stake here." The billionaire's eyes narrowed. "Looking out for us? Or looking out for yourself?" he shot back, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. His heart raced as the weight of the decision pressed down on him, the one he had been avoiding for weeks. She had convinced him of so much, wrapped him in promises of shared success, a life of luxury and power, but this felt wrong. The young girl who had been silent up until now, standing near the doorway, watched the scene unfold with a quiet intensity that made the room feel even smaller. Her eyes, full of empathy but unyielding in their resolve, caught the billionaire's gaze. She stepped forward, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the growing storm. "You don't have to go along with this," she said, her words soft but unwavering, each syllable charged with conviction. The fiancé turned on her, her expression darkening. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Stay out of this." But the young girl stood her ground, her posture firm, her eyes never leaving the billionaire's face. "You deserve more than this," she said, her voice almost pleading, but with a strength that couldn't be ignored. "This woman isn't thinking about you, she's thinking about herself. Can't you see it?" The billionaire's eyes flickered between the two women, his fiancée, so polished and poised, and the young girl, so raw and honest in her simplicity. The contrast was striking, and for the first time, he began to truly see the fiancée's manipulations, the way she had carefully constructed her world of promises and deceptions, all for the sake of control. He swallowed hard, the knot in his throat tightening. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked the fiancée, his voice a mix of hurt and anger. "Why hide the truth from me all this time?" The fiancée hesitated, her face now a mask of irritation, but there was no denying the crack in her composure. "Because I knew you wouldn't understand," she replied, her voice low, defensive. "You're not capable of seeing the bigger picture. This is for your own good, our good." The young girl, sensing the turning tide, didn't wait for the billionaire to speak again. She stepped closer, her voice stronger now, with the clarity of someone who had fought for what was right before. "You can choose, right now, to live a life that's truly yours," she said, her eyes meeting his with a quiet sincerity. "This contract isn't just a piece of paper. It's a decision that will change everything. You can still choose to trust yourself. Trust your instincts." The billionaire stood frozen, the world around him blurring as his mind raced. The weight of the decision before him was almost unbearable, each option pulling him in a different direction. On one side, there was the woman he had trusted, the woman who had promised him a future of stability and luxury. On the other, there was a young girl, whose honesty and conviction seemed like a breath of fresh air in the midst of the suffocating web of deceit. His heart thudded in his chest, the moment of truth crashing over him like a wave. This was no longer about wealth or status. It was about his future, his soul, his freedom. Could he walk away from the life he had built with her? Could he stand up for what he knew was right, for what his heart was telling him? His hands trembled slightly as he held the weight of the moment settled on the billionaire like a cold, undeniable truth. He stood in his luxurious office, looking out at the sprawling cityscape beyond, his mind racing, heart pounding. The contract lay on his desk, the ink still fresh, but the words felt like chains, binding him to a future that no longer felt his own. For weeks, he had been swept up in the whirlwind of his fiancée's ambitions, charmed by her beauty and promises of power. But now, standing at this precipice, he could see the truth: his future was being traded away for the sake of a deal, and he was no longer willing to be a pawn in her game. His fiancée, with her well-crafted smile and carefully chosen words, had led him into this trap. But it was the young girl, an innocent bystander who had no reason to intervene, whose warning had cracked the veil of illusion. "Don't trust her," she had said, her eyes filled with a quiet, undeniable certainty. "You're worth more than this. Don't lose yourself." At the time, he had brushed it off as the naive concern of someone too young to understand the world of business and power, but the words echoed in his mind now, ringing louder than ever before. The billionaire had always prided himself on his ability to make decisions, to control his destiny. But for too long, he had let others pull the strings. Now, he could feel his own power returning. With one decisive motion, he picked up the pen, poised to sign the deal that would solidify his future, except he couldn't do it. The weight of it was too much. This wasn't the future he wanted. He pushed the contract aside and stood up, his breath steadying. It was time to take control. It was time to break free. His fiancée had entered the room moments later, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her expression one of expectancy, as if she already knew the deal was about to be finalized. But when she saw him standing there, the contract untouched, her face faltered. "What's this?" she asked, her voice laced with an icy edge, the sweetness that had once charmed him now replaced with something colder, more calculating. "Are you going to back out now? After everything we've discussed?" The billionaire looked at her, the realization settling deep within him. She wasn't the woman he had fallen in love with, she was a business partner, an accomplice in a scheme he had never truly understood until now. "I'm not signing it," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "I've made my decision." The words hung in the air, a declaration of his newfound independence, and in that moment, he felt a weight lift from his chest. The fiancée's eyes flashed with fury, her polished exterior cracking under the pressure of his rejection. "You don't know what you're doing," she spat, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Do you think you can walk away from this? From me? You're nothing without me, without this deal. You'll be left with nothing but the ashes of your own ego." Her words were sharp, venomous, but they no longer held power over him. He had spent too long being manipulated, too long sacrificing his own happiness and integrity for the sake of others. "You're wrong," he said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not nothing. And I'm not going to lose myself for the sake of a deal, or for anyone." The fiancée's face contorted in anger, her fists clenched at her sides as the reality of the situation began to sink in. She had never expected him to reject her, to walk away from everything she had carefully orchestrated. To her, it was a betrayal, her future slipping through her fingers as her world crumbled. "You're making a mistake," she hissed, her voice breaking as her composure slipped entirely. "You'll regret this. You'll regret not trusting me." But the billionaire stood firm, no longer swayed by her empty threats or false promises. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back now. He wasn't the man he had been when he first met her, naive and willing to trade his soul for a future that was never truly his. He was a man who had found his voice again, who had regained the strength to shape his own destiny. As the fiancée stormed out of the room, her anger still reverberating in the air, he stood alone, stronger, freer than he had been in years. The young girl's warning had been the turning point, the moment that shattered the illusion and brought him back to himself. It was a simple phrase, but it had unlocked the door to his future. For the first time in a long while, the billionaire felt the fire of possibility burn brightly within him. He had escaped not just from the contract, but from the web of manipulation that had ensnared him for so long. He was ready to face the world on his own terms, to reclaim his life, and to build a future that was truly his. In the dimly lit office, the billionaire sat across from the young girl, her face unusually serious for someone so young, yet there was a quiet strength in her demeanor. The tension in the room was palpable as she prepared to reveal a truth that would shatter his world. For months, the billionaire had been lost in the gleaming allure of his fiancée's beauty and charm, blinded by the promises of a future built together. He had trusted her implicitly, even as the world around him warned him to be cautious. But now, sitting before him, the girl who had once been a mere shadow in the background spoke words that cut through him like a blade. With a calm voice, she explained the intricate web of deceit, detailing how his fiancée had carefully crafted a plan to manipulate him into signing a contract that would ensure she inherited his wealth, should anything happen to him. It was a betrayal so cold, so calculated, that it took everything in him to process the truth. She had used his affections, his vulnerability, his desire for companionship, as weapons to strip him of everything he had worked for. His fiancée had never loved him, he realized, and the sting of that truth was worse than any financial loss could ever be. The young girl, though she had only recently entered his life, had proven herself not just as someone to be trusted, but as a guardian of his soul. Her bravery in confronting him, in revealing the depth of the treachery, was something he could never have expected. He felt a surge of gratitude for her intelligence, her ability to see what others, including him, had failed to. The billionaire had built empires, negotiated multimillion-dollar deals, and faced every obstacle with ruthless precision, but nothing had prepared him for this moment: the profound emotional devastation of realizing that the person he had once envisioned as his partner had been plotting his downfall all along. As the words sank in, he could feel the weight of them pressing down on him. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the immense personal betrayal that was beginning to unravel within him. This wasn't just about money, it was about trust, about love, and about how easily the most precious things in life could be turned into commodities, bartered and sold for the highest bidder. The girl continued, her voice steady, but there was an undeniable empathy in her eyes, as if she understood the depth of his pain more than anyone else in the room. She spoke of the fiancé's calculated moves, how she had gradually isolated him from his family, how she had turned his friends into allies in her scheme, and how she had manipulated every situation to her advantage, all under the guise of love and devotion. It was as if the entire relationship had been nothing more than a well-rehearsed act, a performance designed to secure her own future, regardless of the damage done to him. The billionaire listened in stunned silence, his mind racing as the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. He had been so certain of her sincerity, so convinced that their connection was real. The shame of his naivete was overwhelming. He had placed his trust in someone who had seen him as nothing more than a means to an end, a way to satisfy her own insatiable hunger for wealth and power. The more the girl spoke, the more his heart sank. He could feel the anger rising in him, but it was not just anger toward his fiancée, it was also directed at himself. How could he have been so blind? How could he have missed the subtle signs of manipulation? His empire, his legacy, had almost been reduced to nothing in the hands of someone he had once considered his equal. The girl's revelation didn't just strip away the layers of trust between him and his fiancée, it also exposed the vulnerability he had buried deep within himself, a vulnerability he hadn't realized he had until this moment. He had always relied on his intellect, his control over every situation, but now he saw how easily everything could have crumbled, how everything he had built could have been taken from him in the blink of an eye. The realization of how close he had been to losing everything was suffocating. But amidst the pain and the shock, there was also a strange sense of relief. The truth had been uncovered, and with it, the opportunity to correct the course of his life before it was too late. He looked at the girl once more, a soft gratitude in his eyes. Without her, he would have been blind to the betrayal that was creeping ever closer, an insidious force that could have destroyed him. And in that moment, he understood that the most valuable thing in life wasn't wealth or power, it was the trust and loyalty of those who saw you for who you truly were, not for what you could offer. He was thankful for the girl's bravery, for her ability to stand up and speak the truth when so many others would have stayed silent. She had saved him, not just from a financial disaster, but from losing his sense of self, from becoming a victim of his own desires. The billionaire knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that, with the truth now revealed, he could rebuild stronger, wiser, and, most importantly, more discerning than before. In the final chapter of his life as he knew it, the billionaire stood on the precipice of something entirely new, a life free from the manipulation that had once bound him, a life where the strings of deceit no longer tugged at his every decision. He had spent years surrounded by power, wealth, and privilege, but it had all been built on a foundation of lies. His days had been consumed with ruthless deals and high-stakes negotiations, each one feeding his belief that the world was a game to be won, and that he was its master. But his reality had crumbled when he nearly fell victim to an elaborate scam, a plot so intricately designed that even his sharpest instincts couldn't detect it in time. It was the young girl, the one he had once overlooked, dismissed as insignificant in the grand scheme of his world, who had saved him. She was a stranger, an outsider, someone who didn't belong in the circles he frequented, but it was precisely this outsider status that allowed her to see through the scam when no one else could. She had seen the warning signs, heard the whispers of something wrong, and, against all odds, had acted with the courage and clarity that the billionaire had long since lost. When the truth came to light, when the depths of the scheme were revealed, the billionaire was left not just shaken, but profoundly humbled. The young girl, with her quiet determination and unassuming nature, had acted out of kindness, saving him from what could have been a disastrous fall. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. The billionaire, once so accustomed to trusting only himself and the people who bowed to his influence, now understood the true value of the people around him, the ones who had no vested interest in his wealth, the ones who saw him for who he truly was, not for the mask he had worn for so long. They were the ones who had been there all along, waiting for him to see the truth. It was a painful realization, but one that was impossible to ignore. He had been living a life full of illusions, and the girl had opened his eyes to the harsh reality that his success had come at a cost not just to others, but to himself. His wealth had isolated him, made him a target for those who would exploit his vulnerabilities, and in his pursuit of more, he had neglected the most important thing, the people who cared about him and his well-being. Now, with the scam thwarted and his eyes wide open, the billionaire found himself standing at the threshold of a new beginning. He no longer saw the world as a game to be won, but as a place to be navigated with humility, caution, and, above all, trust. The young girl's actions had saved him from losing everything, but it was her unwavering belief in him that had sparked something deeper inside him. They had formed an unlikely bond, one that transcended the barriers of wealth, status, and experience. It was a bond born not of mutual benefit, but of genuine respect and understanding. Two people from vastly different worlds, brought together by fate, each teaching the other something valuable. For the billionaire, the lesson was clear: he could no longer afford to ignore the warnings of others, to dismiss the voices of those who had no ulterior motive but to see him succeed. His arrogance, his self-reliance, had blinded him for so long, but now he knew that true strength came not from isolation, but from connection to those who cared, to those who would speak the truth even when it was uncomfortable. As he moved forward, the billionaire made a promise to himself: he would never again allow himself to be manipulated by the world around him, nor would he close his ears to the voices that mattered. The people who truly cared for him would be his compass, guiding him through the stormy seas of life with a steadiness he had never known. And as for the young girl, he vowed to never forget the role she had played in his salvation. She had shown him that sometimes the most unlikely people could become the most powerful forces in our lives, not through their strength or influence, but through their integrity and courage. With a deep sense of gratitude and a heart that was finally open, the billionaire began to rebuild. This time, he was not driven by the need to prove himself or accumulate more wealth, but by the desire to live a life that was truly meaningful, one rooted in wisdom, kindness, and the strength that comes from being surrounded by people who care. As the story drew to a close, the billionaire was no longer the man who had once lived in the shadows of his own ego. He was a man who had learned, painfully but profoundly, the importance of humility and the power of second chances. And with that, he stepped into a new beginning, one where the future was uncertain, but filled with hope.